We still got people in the waiting room, Jen. Right, we'll give people a moment to come through before we get started properly. Any more for any more? No, can't see anybody else as yet. Right, we will give it a minute because we were expecting a few more. So whilst we're waiting, I'll say a very warm welcome to those that are with us currently, and really appreciate you joining today's workshop. It is absolutely a workshop rather than a webinar, so we do want your input, interaction, and I hope you've come with some questions and issues to explore. I'm hesitating on starting, Jen, because a couple of people have popped in since I've said we're going to make a start, or wait a minute. Can you see anybody else who's waiting to come in? No. In that case, we will crack on. So for those that don't know me, I'm Jo Lappin. I'm the Chief Executive of the Cumbria LEP, and I'm delighted today to say that we're joined by, I knew that would happen as soon as I started, Alan Kennedy and Paige Lewis from Womble Bond Dickinson, who we've appointed to give some support and advice to our business community around employing overseas workers. And the reason that we wanted to do this workshop is one of the most significant issues, alongside everything else that's currently facing business, is acute labour supply issues. And just to put a bit of context around that, because I'm conscious I've got new faces today that aren't regularly seen in our wider governance bodies. In 2010 to 2020, the population in the UK, working age population, grew by 2.9%. In Cumbria, it declined by 6.4%. So we have got the slowest growing population in England. Don't worry, I'll send you the slides, because I will also give you the projections for 2020 to 2030. Suffice to say, it doesn't get any better. In the UK, we're looking at working age population growth of 1.6%. In Cumbria, a further decline of 4.9%. So the challenges that we face in terms of labour are actually much more significant than many other places. We also have a greater representation of businesses that are being faced nationally by labour supply issues. So before we went into the pandemic, about 22% of our workforce was in sectors related to the visitor economy, which is a much bigger proportion than you would find elsewhere. So the combination of the structure of our economy and our declining working age population means that we have got some particular challenges. And working with, we have a specific group looking at labour supply. Working with that group, one of the key themes is how do we grow our labour pool in Cumbria? Because we can't grow our own. We've got to be looking outside to be able to bring more people in. So I think that's more than enough by way of introduction. Today's session is being recorded so that we can share Alan and Paige's input with lots of other colleagues on our website, so that they've got something they can take away. In advance of today's session, we forwarded to all of our attendees a copy of a very helpful briefing note that had been produced by Alan and Paige. And again, very happy to pick up any questions. But to help give a sense of who's here, it'd be really, really helpful if I can go around my screen and invite you to say who you are, where you're from, and what's brought you here today. So why is this particularly of interest? So to give you time to sort of gather your thoughts, I'll start by asking Alan and then Paige to introduce themselves, who they are, what their expertise is in this area. So Alan, please.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. So as a very sort of brief introduction as to who I am, I work at Womble Bond Dickinson, and I'm a managing associate. I work across both the employment team in the immigration practice. So in terms of the immigration side of things, what we generally cover is mostly what I would say is business or corporate immigration matters. So a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today, but things like assisting with sponsor license applications, with visa applications under the points-based system, so like skilled worker visas, global business mobility visas. We also assist clients with, which is really key, obviously, prevention of illegal working and right to work checks. And we also help clients with like training and support on sponsor duties, any home office compliant visits and things like that. So that's a general quick stop introduction. And Paige, I'll pass over to you if that's all right.
Thanks, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Paige. I'm a solicitor in the corporate immigration and employment team as well. Like Alan said, the types of things we assist clients with are the corporate immigration side. As you can imagine, it's keeping us quite busy at the moment. It's an interesting area, hopefully, as you'll see as we get into the session. And it's also a very sort of rapidly changing area as well. It's quite reactive to things that are obviously going on around us. So it's one that we have to stay up to date with quite a lot. I, with Alan, operate out of the Newcastle office, but I live in Penrith in Cumbria. I know most of you are based here as well. So good to speak with you today.
Lovely, thank you. So if I can go around my screen, Jen, can I start with you, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jen Hewitt and I am Executive Assistant at Cumbria LEP.
Thanks, Jen. Next on my screen is Molly.
Hi everyone, I'm Molly. I'm the Project and Partnerships Coordinator at Cumbria Tourism. So I'm on this call really to sort of support our members because we get a lot of our businesses asking about this sort of thing. So it'd be good to know a bit of information about it really.
Lovely, Molly. Welcome. Thank you. Mark, you're next.
Hi, my name is Mark Beecham. I'm from Armstrong Watson, based in Carlisle. My role is head of people for the organisation. And I think the reason that I'm on this meeting is just to see what's involved. Should we require, overseas workers at some point in the future?
Thank you, Mark, and welcome. I was going to say you're in the very rare experience of being outnumbered at the moment by female participants. That doesn't happen very often, does it? Right, Elizabeth. Sorry, you're on mute. Too many different platforms, isn't it? Mute on this one, bottom left-hand corner.
There we go, got me now. Okay, sorry, hi there, Joe. Yeah, my name's Elizabeth. I work on a temporary basis for Turnstone HR. They're a self-employed company who work for lots of different companies in Barrow, Cumbria region, and they're contracted for various HR services. A lot of recently, which have been dealing with visa issues, questions about visas, applications and stuff. So it's in their interest to find out what the do's and don'ts and necessities are.
Well, you're in the perfect place if that's what your business is, Elizabeth. So welcome. Next up, we've got Helen, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helen Shaw. I'm the HR manager at the Oakley Trust. We're based in Kendal and we have a local office in Durham. That's where I'm at today. So I'm not only looking for guidance on potentials to look to employ people from overseas for Cumbria, but also to complement our services in the Northeast as well. So I'm just looking for some further guidance on that process and what's involved. Lovely. Welcome, Helen. Thank you.
Rachel, we've got two Rachels today. So we're going to have Rachel W and Rachel T. Rachel W, you're first on my screen, please.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Lodezak. I have recently joined the Cumbria LEP, so this is my third week, Head of Employment and Skills. So hopefully by my job title, you can tell that I'm really interested in this today, because obviously where we do have skill gaps, it'd be great to know if we can ask overseas workers to help us with those skills. So yeah, nice to meet you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And next it's Rachel T.
Hi, I'm also from Cumbria Tourism, work with Molly. We're working very closely on trying to get as many people into our industry as possible, looking at the talent pipeline for the future. So it's an obvious one for us, really. And we were just one of us was going to come on the call, but we decided as it's quite a detailed subject, we probably both need to listen directly. So we're both here.
Lovely. Welcome, Rachel. Chloe, can I invite you in now, please?
I'll just put my video on. There. Yes, well, I'm Chloe from SIS Pitches. I'm the HR officer. So it's actually my manager that deals with our sponsorship license and things like that. She's on leave at the moment, so I'm basically just stepping in, going to take some notes. Eventually, there is the view for me to be a part of it as well. So it's just to sort of gain some more insight and information, and yeah, take it from there.
Welcome and thank you for joining us. Next, I've got Caroline.
I'll just wait for the video to kick in. Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm from Cumbria Deaf Association. I'm the GM here, and we are looking to bring one particular person back from the States. She used to work for us, and we want to bring her back over now. So that's why I'm on the call today.
Thanks, Caroline, and welcome. And I think the last person to come in is Shibi.
Hi, I'm Shibi. I'm from McMahon Engineering Services. So we do have a sponsor license, and I've been dealing with the sponsorship license and also the candidates, the international candidates as well. So actually my first candidate and skilled workforce is arriving today. So he's actually arrived in UK, but it's just, there are some, when I've been through this process, I've noticed it's been, I've learned a lot. There's a combination of where I can give my learning as well, but at the same time, there are a lot of other issues which people are not aware of, which I've gone through as well. So it's something, a two-way process I'm looking at this moment.
Lovely, thank you, Shibi. So as we go through, it would be great if you could share some of that experience. So hopefully that gives Alan and Paige a sense of where people are coming from and what their interest is. In terms of format, we're going to have a presentation that basically walks us through some of the information that you've got in the pack that we sent out. We then want to go to a very open question and answer session. We have had 2 questions notified in advance, so only one of the individuals is here, so that question we can clearly ask. But as we're going along, if thoughts strike you, can you put them into the chat and then we'll pick them up as soon as we've gone through the presentation. That sound all right? All happy with that? For those that joined slightly late, the session is being recorded. And it's only being recorded because we'll use it as a learning tool for others so that other businesses can pick up on the presentation, etc. So hopefully that's okay with everybody. Everyone happy? Brilliant. In that case, Alan, Paige, please lead us off with the presentation.
Great, thanks, Joe. That's a really thorough introduction. And it's really useful to know who's on the call, what they are looking to get out of this session, and hopefully what we've got sort of planned in terms of the topics to discuss will hopefully cover those things. But as Joe mentioned, we'll run through for 30 minutes to do a sort of like a mini presentation, and then we've got a few scenarios to do and to run through, and then we'll have a good period of time, hopefully 30-40 minutes at the end, to really open it up to everyone in terms of any questions and group discussions and things like that. So I think that's where we'll probably get the most benefit, because people can obviously share experiences and then quiz us and ask us questions on things that they've either got concerns about, current concerns, or things that might be happening in the future. So I guess, yeah, just to start things off, I mean, the whole purpose of today's presentation workshop is to give an overview of the UK immigration system and basically how businesses can take advantage of employing workers from overseas and accessing the talent that's over there. So over the next 30 minutes, we intend to cover some of the following areas, which I think is up on the slide. So firstly, an overview of the sponsor license process and basically how to apply for a license, including how much it costs, which is always a relevant question, and then any compliance duties once you've got the license. We'll also look at the different types of visas, so things like the skilled worker visas, the global business mobility visas, which is a new route that's been introduced, the scale-up visas, and then also non-sponsored routes, so where sponsor license isn't necessarily required. Then we'll have a quick look at a review of eligible job roles, and we'll try and cover some of the most relevant sectors, which I think are things like advanced manufacturing, logistics, health and social care, rural, hospitality and tourism. So looking at which jobs we are saying are classed as skilled worker roles, because they're the roles that obviously the sponsor, like you can use the sponsor license for. And then we'll have it's not on that slide there, but we'll have a quick discussion towards the end about the recent changes to right to work checks, because it is quite a topical area. There's been quite a lot of changes recently that the government's introduced, and it's really important to get that right to prevent illegal working and the consequences that can come off the back of it. And as I say, at the end of that presentation, we'll then go through 2 scenarios that we've got, and then we'll open it up to a group discussion. So Paige, if you could just click the next slide, that would be really helpful. So this is sort of a whistle-stop tour of sponsor licenses, because the Home Office has a guidance document, which I think is around about 200 to 300 pages long. So, you know, obviously don't intend to go through all of that, but I want to give a good overview of what is required, why do we need one, and how do you go about applying for one. So generally, I guess the starting point, and this might be quite, people on the call might already be aware of this because they might have gone through the process, but generally, if you're looking to recruit an individual from overseas, you're going to have to think about whether you need a sponsor license, because that's a requirement from the Home Office immigration rules. And before Brexit, you know, a sponsor license was only really required when you were looking to employ non-EU workers, you know, which might have been a lot easier. But obviously now that free movement's come to an end, EU workers are obviously lumped into that too. And, you know, it doesn't cover every EU worker, because, you know, EU workers obviously had the right all the way up to last year to apply for pre-settled or settled status under the EU settlement scheme. So where you've got EU workers that have either got settled or pre-settled status, then, you know, yes, they don't need to be sponsored, but any other EU workers, especially those that are coming to the UK now and don't have that status, you know, that they'll certainly or potentially needs to be sponsored by an employer. So the primary routes where sponsorship's required, so we've got the skilled worker route. So that's the main route, I would say, and the majority of overseas workers are generally sponsored under this route, and it requires a skilled job which is paid at a certain level, a certain salary threshold. And Paige is going to talk about that in a lot more detail later on. And then we've got the global business mobility route, which covers 5 subcategories. As I say, it was a new route that was introduced to the Home Office recently. And the most popular one for the purposes of today, I would say, is the senior and specialist worker route, which used to be called intra-company transfer. And as the name suggests, it's applicable to those companies who basically have overseas branches, so an overseas branch in a UK entity, and where companies look to transfer skilled workers, you know, intra-company across the two groups. So when you look to apply for a license, the Home Office has very strict criteria that you have to comply with. And the reason for that is because they don't just want anyone applying for these licenses, because there are certain compliance duties, there's certain things that sponsors have to do to make sure that individuals from overseas are working here legally. So 2 things that you first of all have to look at is whether you meet the eligibility criteria and the suitability criteria. So the eligibility criteria is quite straightforward, and what the Home Office asks you to do is provide documentation to basically evidence that you're a genuine organisation that's operating and trading in the UK. So that's the first requirement. So hopefully fairly straightforward, and that could involve companies' house documents or annual reports or annual accounts, things like that. And then the Home Office also asks you to meet something called suitability criteria. And that covers a range of things, but it covers things like making sure, and this is probably the most important one, making sure that you've got a robust HR and recruitment system in place to make sure that you can manage your overseas workers and comply with your sponsor duties. So that is a key one. And the Home Office will either judge this by the application and the documents that are provided with the sponsor license. So the better the documents, the more likely that they are to do that. Or they'll decide, if they've got any concerns, that they might do an on-site compliance visit, either before or after the license is granted. And generally you'll want to avoid that because obviously, you know, you come under a bit more scrutiny. But they're the two things that the Home Office would look to do. You've also got to show that you can offer a genuine vacancy, which meets the Home Office requirements. So if you're applying for example, a skilled worker sponsor license, you're going to have to demonstrate that you either have roles in the pipeline where you which are eligible, so skilled roles that will meet the salary thresholds and everything else that comes with it. And you've got to demonstrate that none of your directors have any unspent criminal convictions which are related to immigration offences, and that there's been no previous non-compliance by the organisation when it comes to immigration. So, you know, the organisation hasn't applied for a sponsor licence and been rejected, or they haven't had one in the past and it got revoked. So, Paige, just on the next slide, if you don't mind, just looking at the application process. So, generally, it requires an online application form and a number of supporting documents to be provided. What I would say is the online application form isn't difficult. You know, it would take you about half an hour to complete if you had all the information, but it's got to include things like, you know, details about the company, which you would have, the route you're applying for. So as I said, the skilled worker route or the GBM route, whether you're applying as a single entity or you're including any other UK or overseas branches. So you might apply as a head office and then include all your branches under it. And then details about the key personnel who will manage the license, which I'll come on to in a second. What I would say is that the application form itself, as I say, isn't that difficult to complete. But where I think a lot of people fall down is the supporting documents, because the Home Office has a big list that sets out the certain documents, specific documents that must be provided. And it depends on which route you're ultimately applying for. And the key to this is, you know, you could go through the time and effort to submit your license, appoint key personnel, pay the license fee, but if you provide the wrong documents, ultimately the Home Office is going to reject the application. So it's key to get that right. And I guess what I mean by certain documents, you know, for example, if you were applying for a global business mobility sponsor license and you were looking to apply for the route that allows you to transfer workers from an overseas entity to a UK entity, the Home Office, a strict requirement is that you have to provide a document that shows common ownership or control between the two entities. So again, there's a whole load of documents like an affidavit by a senior individual, an annual report that lists the overseas entities, but you have to provide the right one. Otherwise, it's highly likely to get rejected. And as I mentioned, you have to then, you know, an important consideration before you even start to apply for a license is who's going to be the key personnel. And what I mean about key personnel is, you know, who's going to manage and be responsible for the license. And the Home Office, again, is really key on this, and they'll do their audit checks on this because they need responsible, honest individuals in charge of that license to ultimately avoid any wrongdoing or not following the rules. So the people that you have to have in place, and this is a mandatory requirement, so you have to have an authorising officer. So that has to be the most senior person in the organisation that's responsible for recruitment in HR. And that person will be ultimately responsible for whatever happens on the licence, and they'll be responsible for the other key personnel. Then you have the key contact. So that's the person who will be, as it says, the key contact between on the sponsor license and with the Home Office. And they should be, in terms of who that person should be, it really should be someone that can answer questions on the application form and any questions on the sponsor license going forward. So if the Home Office had a question, they wouldn't go directly to the Home Office, the authorising officer first, they would go to the key contact. And then you've got level 1 user. So that can be one person or it can be a number of people. But ultimately, a level 1 user is someone that's responsible for the day-to-day management of the license. And how they manage that license is through something called a sponsor management system, which is ultimately, you know, an online system called an SMS, which is how you sort of monitor and manage that license. And you could have one person, you could have the authorizing, the key personnel could be one person. It could be the same person for the authorizing officer, the key contact, the level 1 user, or you might decide to have multiple people. What I would say though, is that there are suitability requirements and mandatory requirements for each of the personnel. So they have to be permanently based in the UK throughout the duration of their role. So that's, you can't have an HR representative based in the US as the authorizing officer, for example. It has to be someone that's based in the UK. It has to be a paid member of staff or engaged as an office holder. There are some exceptions to that where a legal representative such as us can be appointed as the key personnel, but we could only be appointed as, for example, a key contact or a level 1 user. You can't have someone that doesn't work for the organization appointed as the authorizing officer. But for the other two roles, you could either have someone within the organization or you could have a legal representative running those roles. And then the other consideration is that none of these personnel can have an unspent criminal conviction for a relevant immigration offence. So again, that sort of honesty suitability check. Once the application form is ready to submit, the authorising officer has to submit that application. We can help with the application, but a legal representative can't press submit on the application. It has to be the authorising officer, and that person has to pay an application fee. And the application fees aren't actually that expensive. Generally, it's about £500 to £536 for a small or charitable sponsor, and it's £1,476 for a medium to large sponsor. And if you think, well, which one are we? The criteria is if you meet any two of the following. So you have an annual turnover that's 10.2 million or less, your total assets are worth 5.1 million or less, or you have 50 employees or fewer. So if you meet 2 out of 3 of those criteria, or all 3, then you'd be classed as a small sponsor. The only other thing to mention about the application process is that it can take a while for a decision to be made. The current wait times are around about 8 weeks. So once you submit the application and you've submitted your supporting documents, you've then got to wait around 8 weeks for a decision. We used to see decisions within about 4 or 5 weeks, but because of the Ukraine crisis, because of Brexit, the Home Office, the wait times are pretty much what they say. So I think generally I would expect to wait about 8 weeks for a decision. You can, however, use a priority service, which gives you a decision within 10 working days, but that comes at a cost of £500, which is obviously on top of the fee. So I guess if you're looking to sponsor someone in the future, you've got to build in these wait times. So if you're thinking, we want to employ a skilled worker, okay, we don't have a sponsor license, we need to build in a bit of time to get all the information and documentation together. Then we've got to build in time for an 8-week turnaround process. And then we've got to build in time for the time to get the visa. So it's just, I suppose, preparation is key in all of these things. And then once you've got the license, you should receive, if the license is correct, if the application's correct and all the supporting documents are correct, you should receive an A rating, which basically allows you to start sponsoring individuals and assigning what they call certificates of sponsorship. On the other hand, if the application's rejected or refused, you might be able to reapply straight away, or you might be subject to a 6-month cooling off period where you couldn't apply within that time. Which if you had someone in mind like a skilled worker, then that would be a big issue. So ultimately, whether you can apply straight away or be subject to this cooling off period, it will depend on why the application was refused. And I guess the only other point to mention on applications is, once you get the license, it's not indefinite. It's valid for a period of 4 years, and you need to make sure that you apply for a renewal application before the expiry date. But the Home Office send you notification emails before that date, so you shouldn't miss it. It's just to be aware of. Paige, on the next slide. Just going to give a really quick overview of compliance obligations. So once you've got the license, there is an ongoing compliance obligation and duties on sponsors. And what I would say is, you obviously need to think carefully about getting a sponsor license, because you then become under greater scrutiny by the Home Office. You're under their sort of microscope a little bit. And the types of duties, compliance duties I'm referring to, are things like record keeping duties and monitoring and reporting duties. So in terms of reporting, as a sponsor, you have to notify and keep the Home Office updated on certain changes within specific time limits. And the Home Office are quite key on this sort of stuff, because it shows, again, that you're a responsible sponsor. So, for example, certain things have to be reported within 10 working days, and it includes things like, you know, if your sponsored worker doesn't actually start their role, or they've been absent for 10 days or more, where there's been significant changes to the individual's employment, such as, you know, they've changed roles or they've had a change in salary. Really, a reduction in salary is what the Home Office is more bothered about. If the employment ends earlier than the date shown on the certificate of sponsorship, or if the work is affected by 2P because, you know, they would be transferring to another company. And some changes must have to be reported within 20 working days, and that includes where, for example, the company might change its name, if it sells all or part of its business, or it's involved in a merger, because again, the structure's changed, so the Home Office needs to know if you're still a responsible sponsor, or if the company goes into insolvency. And you'll also need to update the Home Office if there's any changes to your key personnel on the license. In terms of record keeping duties, again, this is really important, and this is why you need to have robust HR systems in place to make sure that you comply with your record keeping duties. But it includes things like, you know, having a system and ensuring that you keep up-to-date contact details for each sponsored migrant worker, having evidence of their immigration status, which follows into their right to work. So you need to have, you know, a copy of their visa or BRP on the file. You need to keep employment contracts and any offer letters on file to demonstrate that they're working in accordance with the details on the certificates of sponsorship. And you have to have, and you should really keep evidence of any absences or change in circumstances. And it's really important to be aware of all that, because I think when people generally get sponsor licenses, they think, right, the hard work's done, we'll sponsor the individual and then we'll forget about it. And that generally happens quite a lot. And we generally get people coming to us saying, something's happened, but we forgot to tell the Home Office and it happened months ago. That's where you start to get into problems and you start to look like you're not on top of things. And it's important because a failure to comply with those sort of things can result in fines, and it can even result in your license being revoked or downgraded. And the problem with that is, if you've got individuals sponsored under the license, they could have their visas curtailed, which ultimately means they have to leave the UK within a 60-day period. So that's why it's quite key. I think that covers pretty much all the key points on sponsor licenses. Hopefully I've covered most of the things there, but if anyone has any questions, we can obviously address them at the end, and I'll pass over to Paige.
Great, thanks, Alan. So if you are thinking about sponsoring migrant workers, you've probably got a couple of more practical questions. So Alan touched on who can apply. So obviously following Brexit, it includes EU nationals and non-EU nationals. It also includes dependents, so partners and children. They can apply sort of off the back of, for example, their wife or husband's skilled worker visa. In terms of cost, there are quite a few immigration fees that are part of the process. So the certificate of sponsorship is £199, and you pay that at the time of assigning it in the SMS. The visa application fee, so this is separate to the sponsor license application fee that Alan mentioned. So this is when you're submitting, you've got the license in place, and you're at the point of submitting the actual visa application. So I've put a range there for the main business routes that we're going to look at. There are some routes that have a slightly lower fee, but generally it's sort of between £600 to sort of £1,500, and what you pay depends on how long the visa's being assigned for, where they're applying from. So if that's inside or outside the UK, for some reason, it's a little bit more expensive if you are applying from inside the UK. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but both are sort of dealt with in sort of totally separate teams within the UKVI, and obviously outside UK, and the route as well. So all those factors will sort of have input on what the application fee is. So that's paid at the point of submitting the application form online alongside the health surcharge, and that's £624 per year. And that goes towards, you know, healthcare and NHS and things like that, whilst the workers here in the UK. There's the skills charge as well, and that's payable at the time of assigning the cost. So that's at the start of this process. That is per year. What you pay depends on the size of the company as well. So applying the same criteria that Alan mentioned, if you're a small or charitable business, it'll be 364. If you're medium or large, it'll be 1,000. And for example, if you're employing someone on a 5-year visa, you pay the full skills charge upfront at the time of assigning the cost as well. So if you're a medium or large company, that £5,000 will be payable at that point. In terms of how long it takes, again, it depends on whether you're applying from outside the UK or inside the UK. If it's an outside UK application, standard processing times are 3 weeks. And like Alan said, we're seeing it sort of maxing out at the full 3 weeks, just because things are so busy at the moment for UKVI. If it's an inside UK application, it'll be 8 weeks. There are priority services that you can use, and I've put the additional fees on there to get a quicker decision. So if you use the priority service, it's the aim is to get a decision within 5 working days. Super priority to get it within a day. These were suspended actually quite recently. They only opened up again. I think they ended in they were suspended from sort of mid-March to mid-August. That's because UKVI were reallocating their resources basically to prioritise Ukrainian family visas. So it's good news that they've opened up again, and I mean, I've assisted a couple of clients since it opened last month, and we've successfully used the priority services, so that's it's really handy. So the other question you might have, and the assessment you'll have to make is which route to use basically. There's lots of routes. What we've included here are just the main routes, the primary routes into the UK. There's quite a lot of detail on that slide, but I think it's quite useful to put them next to each other and compare, because that's the assessment you'll carry out, and that assessment will be on an individual sort of case-by-case basis. And as you'll see, there are a number of factors that feed into which route might be most suitable. So on there, we've got the main routes. We've got skilled worker, global business mobility, and scale up. As Alan mentioned, that's a very new route. In terms of the eligibility criteria, the key things that you obviously need to be looking at when you're making the assessment, the job needs to be an eligible job. So like Alan said, that includes an assessment of whether it's a genuine vacancy. So that means, you know, it can't be a sham, it can't not exist, it can't be created just to get that person entry clearance. It has to be genuine. That job must also satisfy the skill level, and it must also fit into a SOC code, which I'll talk about more shortly. And then the salary thresholds as well. So there's minimum salary that must be paid, and again, that's dependent on the type of work and which route you go down. So if you look on the table there, then if we look at skilled workers, you'll see that it's quite a substantially lower salary threshold. It's a lower skill level, and for those reasons, I think it makes it obviously the primary route into the UK, the most common route that we see. We've got global business mobility on there as well. As Alan mentioned, that came in April, so it's quite new. It replaced what you might have heard of as the intra-company transfer, and it's available for companies that have an overseas entity as well. So if you've got a linked entity, for example, in America, and you want to transfer staff over from the US to the UK, then that's one route that is available. There's 5 subcategories to that. So the senior specialist worker, the graduate trainees, the UK expansion worker, that's for entities overseas that don't exist in the UK and that they want to come over and set up an establishment. Secondment and service suppliers as well. And we generally see people coming through on the senior or specialist worker route. So if you look at the table, then you'll see that the skill levels generally higher, and the salary thresholds are higher, and there's also a requirement for them to have worked for the overseas sponsor group for a certain amount of time, unless they're paid 73,900 or more. So that's generally what you'd be looking at for the GBM route. And I guess the senior specialist workers, they come over to fulfill a temporary assignment. So you might have a manager, for example, who you want to come over to fulfill a project or manage a certain team. So they're the sort of circumstances that would be used. We've got scale up on there. It only came into effect on the 22nd of August, I think, so it's quite a new route. Again, the salary threshold is slightly lower than the GBM. It's part of the UK's innovation strategy, so it's available for sort of fast-growing businesses in the UK that want to, access skilled workers. So we haven't dealt with any of them yet, but I'm sure they'll come through. Looking at the table then, if you look at sort of the skilled worker and the scale up, they both lead to settlement. And that's quite a big advantage for those routes. If an individual is in the UK on either a skilled worker or a scale-up visa, then their time spent up to 5 years or more would allow them to apply for settlement. A lot of people, coming over to live and work in the UK want to do so permanently, so that would obviously be a big factor that would sort of have input on which route would be suitable. You'll also see for the skilled worker and the scale up, but not a requirement for the global business mobility, is the requirement to have English language level as part of the evidence to go with the application. Some people might see it as a disadvantage. It's obviously another administrative hurdle to get over, I guess, in the application. But there are a few ways that you can show your English language level. So you can pass an approved test at a test centre, or you can rely on a qualification that was taught in English as well. If you do that, then you also have to send your qualification documents to a third party called ECTIS, and they will give you a certificate to prove that it meets the language threshold and that it's a recognised qualification in the UK. We've done that for lots of applicants, and we've never had sort of any problems with people passing that language level. I think the main concern is obviously the time, and it's just another thing to prepare. And like Alan said, preparation is key. So if you're up against it with timescales and you need somebody here urgently, then you would just want to factor that in. So they're the sponsored routes. We've included here some non-sponsored routes, more just to make you aware of them. Really, if you're, recruiting new people, that you might come up against various different types of visas that allow people the right to work in the UK without having to be sponsored. So students, obviously, if they have a visa to come study in the UK, they can also work under that visa. There's restricted hours. That depends on what they're studying and whether or not it's term time. So for example, if somebody is studying at degree level and it's term time, then they are restricted to 20 hours of work maximum a week. Graduates, after successfully completing their study course, then you can apply for a graduate visa. These are only granted for up to 2 years though. So after that 2-year period, if they want to continue living and working in the UK, then they'd have to apply for another type of visa. Family visas, I mentioned dependents can apply. So for example, if you have somebody applying for a job and they're on a spousal visa because their wife or husband, for example, is in the UK on a skilled worker visa, then by virtue of that spousal visa, they'd have the right to work as well. Similarly, the settlement scheme, you might have heard of the EU settlement scheme following Brexit. This scheme was open to EU nationals to apply for pre-settled or settled status if they were living in the UK before the 31st of December 2020. So if they applied and got their status under that scheme, then again, by virtue of that, they have the right to work. And then finally, I've got the authorised exchange scheme on there. That's a slight anomaly because it is a sponsored route, but it's not the organisation that would be hosting the individual that sponsors them. It would be an external third party. So if I can give you an example, WBD as a law firm, if we have an overseas client that has an in-house legal team and they have a junior member of the team, for example, that they want to send to the UK to, gather knowledge, experience in UK law and practice and take that back to their company overseas, then we could apply for that under the government scheme, but the sponsoring body would be the Law Society, and they're the regulatory body that obviously manage law firms. So we've put that on there just as another one to think about. So the visa application process then, I won't spend too long on this slide because there's quite a detailed sort of guide in the back of the handout that was sent round earlier today. One of the important points to note when you're looking at submitting the visa is when you do that, so you can submit it up to 3 months before. If you do it any earlier than that, then you risk invalidating the application. So again, it's just worth bearing that in mind in sort of when you figure out the timings and the timescales for it. But any time up to 3 months before, you can submit the application online. So you'll assign the certificate of sponsorship. That's an important document that has all the details about the job and the sponsorship that's being offered. Similar to the sponsor license application, you do an online application form, submit that, pay the application fee and the health surcharge. Again, like the sponsor license, there'll be supporting documents. These will be things like, for example, if it's a skilled worker application, proof of English language level, documents relevant to the job, so job descriptions, employment contracts, the certificate of sponsorship as well, proof of ID, passport, national ID cards. Just the more the merrier, the more evidence you can send, the better really. After that, then there'll be a visa appointment to attend in the country that the applicant's applying from. And this will be where they send off the passport to actually get the visa, but also provide their biometric information, which is fingerprint and photo ID. UKVI, anyone who's used any of the systems before will know that they can be quite fiddly and a bit archaic and just not the easiest to use. They are trying to digitize things and make it a bit easier. And in doing that, they've got an app, the UKVI app, that's available for EU nationals that have a biometric passport. So if you look on your passport, I think most of them have a sort of square bracket symbol with a circle in the middle. That means it's got a biometric chip and they can use the app to prove their ID. So again, it just streamlines the process and avoids the need to go to that appointment and then obviously wait for the decision. And the processing clock starts to run once that visa appointment has been attended. So that's when the sort of 3 weeks or the 8 weeks will start to run. So I mentioned SOC codes earlier, and they are occupation categories that the ONS have produced. And if you literally go into Google and put in skilled worker SOC codes, you'll see that there's a really long list of SOC codes on there. And within each SOC code, they've got an identifiable number, an individual number, and then within that you've got the job description, the skill level, and then various job titles as well. And I think there's a bit of a misconception in the business community that it's only sort of the top paid, the top skilled jobs that are eligible for sponsorship. And hopefully, we've put some examples here. Hopefully we can show you that that's not the case. And I think it's worth having a look at that list if you can, and just having a poke about into the different SOC codes, because there's lots of different jobs that are eligible. So we've put some examples on here. So for example, engineers, quality control managers, social workers, welfare professionals, care workers, logistics managers, warehouse managers. And I guess when you're making the assessment to find the right SOC code, what we generally find is you'll have two that it might fit into, and it's a case of assessing the job title alongside the job description and the roles and the duties to find the one that's most suitable. And correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but I don't think we've had a situation where we've had a client come to us wanting to sponsor a role and they haven't been able to find a SOC code. So hopefully that's a little bit of reassurance for you. And again, just some other examples there. So rural, farmers, environmental professionals, hospitality, you've got hotel, restaurant, bar managers, chefs, marketing professionals. So there's lots on there. I will pass on to Alan for the last slide, and then we'll open it up for the case studies.
And what I would say, just following on from that, is that list of skilled workers, the SOC code list, has been expanded since Brexit. So since Brexit, I think the Home Office has recognised that it doesn't really cover low skilled jobs, and with EU workers being included in the mix as well, they've decided to address that by expanding the SOC code list. And I think what's also relevant is the salary threshold used to be, I think, around about 30,000, and it's reduced as well. So they've tried to make it, although it is harder to recruit EU workers because then you obviously need a sponsor license and a visa unless they've got settled status. They've tried to like make it easier in terms of the process. So I think that's worth, and I guess if you go on the SOC code list, there are a number of jobs there that you probably wouldn't have thought as a skilled job, but it's classed as a skilled job in the Home Office's eyes, which is the main thing. So so yeah, all useful to know. And I get the last thing I just wanted to quickly mention, I'm conscious of time, so I'll just really whiz through this. But it's all on prevention of illegal working and ultimately right to work checks. And the reason I wanted to flag it is because it is quite a topical issue at the moment, and we're getting a lot of questions on this. And it's mainly because the guidance and the rules on right to work checks has changed a bit over the last 6 months. And again, it's going to change on Saturday. So, and I suppose, you know, the main reason for flagging this is because it is important to get right, because there is an obligation on all employers, not just those that have got sponsor license. So every employer in the UK has an obligation to prevent illegal working in the UK. And that ultimately involves carrying out right to work checks on every employee that you have before they commence employment. So not the day of, not the day after, you know, before they commence employment. And it's important because obviously if you don't, there's potential sanctions, which can be a civil penalty of up to £20,000 per illegal worker. It could result in a criminal conviction, which carries a prison sentence of up to 5 years and an unlimited fine. And if you've got a sponsor license, you risk it being revoked. So there are reasons to obviously comply with these right to work check rules. And I guess like there has been a lot of changes recently in terms of the right to work checks, but what it has ultimately done is it's now allowed employers, or now required employers, a number of ways to carry out the check. So, you know, before, like maybe a couple of years ago, it was just a manual check, but now you can, so that is still there. So you can still use the manual check, which involves the usual stuff like meeting with the individual in person, obtaining a relevant document. That's going to be a document on either list A or list B on the Home Office guidance website, and taking a copy of that document. You've got online checks now, which involves using the Home Office online check-in service, where you'll have to obtain a share code from the individual, and then you can go into the individual's profile and check if they've got the right to work, and obviously print that off and keep that. Then you've got digital checks, which is a new thing, and it involves something called, and it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's called using an identity document validation technology. And it's a new system, which is currently only available for checks on British and Irish citizens. So it's a digital check, basically. And the type of check that you need to do will depend on a number of factors, and it will depend on the nationality of the worker and the type of visa they have. So it's not as if employers can choose necessarily which check. So you can't necessarily go, right, well, I'm going to do a manual check for that instead of an online. There are some requirements where you have to use an online check. And a classic example of that is from the changes that came into play on the 6th of April, which basically said that anyone, which is the majority of overseas workers, the majority of migrant workers on a skilled worker visa, so anyone that's got a biometric resident permit or card, they can only prove their right to work status via the online check. So if you were an employer and you decided, well, actually, you know, we've always done this by taking a copy of the BRP card, the visa, we've always done it that way, so we'll continue to do it that way. If you did do it that way, which is the way under the old rules, it wouldn't provide you, it wouldn't be a valid check, and it wouldn't provide you with a statutory excuse against a civil penalty. So ultimately, if that individual was found to be here illegally, you couldn't say, well, I carried out a check, so I'm protected. You could only do that if you had carried out an online check. So it's important to be aware of, you know, the changes to the rules. And the other thing that's changing, which I mentioned a second ago, that's changing on Saturday, is that during COVID, we've had these adjusted right to work checks, which ultimately means, you know, you can carry out these manual checks, but instead of meeting the person in person, you can do it via video platform to take into account things like lockdown. But that is being scrapped. So that'll come to an end on Saturday, and we'll be reverting back to, as I say, the normal manual checks in person. The good news is that you don't have to do retrospective checks on any checks that were carried out during that period. So if you did an adjusted right to work check between the 30th of March 2020 and the 30th of September 2022, you know, you can still do that. That's fine. That's, you know, that stays there. You don't have to go back and redo it using the new procedures. And a final point just to be aware of is if you're doing a right to work check and you've got an individual, an applicant that says, you know, I can't provide a share code and I can't provide you with a valid document from list A or B, then you've obviously got a problem because you can't carry out a proper right to work check. But what the Home Office allows you to do is use something called the Employer Checking Service, which is a free online check-in tool to basically check with the Home Office if the individual has a right to work. And an example where that might actually happen is if you've got an individual, an applicant, where their current visa's expired, they've applied for a new visa or they've applied to renew their current visa before the expiry date, they're currently waiting for a decision from the Home Office. That's a classic position where you would use the Employer Check-in Service. And ultimately what you're looking to get is something called a positive verification notice. And that's ultimately that's the Home Office basically telling you that the individual does have the right to work and they've got a valid pending in time visa application with the Home Office. And if you get that positive verification notice, you'll basically have a statutory excuse against a civil penalty for 6 months. And the idea is within that 6-month period, hopefully the individual would get an outcome on their visa application, and then you would follow the normal right to work procedures. So that's all I really wanted to say on right to work checks. There's a huge document on the government website, again, which provides loads of guidance on this. It is quite a difficult and complicated area, and it's important we get it right. But that's sort of a bit of an update on the recent changes. So before we go on to the 2 scenarios, I appreciate we've got around about 30-40 minutes left. Is it worth me just addressing the questions that have come through the Zoom meeting?
I think that would be really helpful, please, Alan, as a place to start. The first question, I think it'd be good for people to actually ask the question. So Helen, you ask the first question, please. Do you want to share that with those in the room?
Hi, Alan. Yes,
Hi,
thanks, Joe. Hello there. I was just wondering, does it have can the person applying for the license who is overall responsible be the same person as, you know, did you say it was the key?
The key contact.
Yeah, can it be the same person, or does it have to be an alternative?
No, it can. The key contact, the authorising officer and the level 1 user could all be the same person. But I think it would have to be, because the authorising officer has to be the most senior person in charge of HR and recruitment. It would have to be that person. So, you know, you couldn't have someone else being the key, you know, those taking up those roles if it was just one person. But it can be, yes, you could have the same person as the authorising officer and the key contact, which is quite common, really, I would say. But you can certainly do that.
Okay, I'm just thinking the size of our HR team and the knowledge within the department as well. So it's what's appropriate really for each organisation, I would assume.
Yeah, and that's the purpose of allowing one person to do the whole thing. I mean, what you would generally find is you would have the authorising officer. Doesn't have to be this way, it depends on the organisation, but you would generally have the authorising officer being, as I say, a senior person. You would have the key contact either being the same person or maybe a legal rep, for example. And then you would have the level 1 user being whoever is going to be managing the SMS on a day-to-day basis. So that might not be that senior person who's the authorising officer. It might be someone else in the HR team, for example. But that's generally how you would structure it.
Lovely, great, that's lovely. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Helen. And next, can I bring in Molly, please, with your question?
Yeah, so I just had a really quick one, and it was just regarding, so when they go through the application process and it happened to get denied or rejected, when they reapply, is it the exact same application process? Do they have to go through all the exact same way? And like, do they still have to pay the same amount of costs that they paid the first time round?
Yeah, so if the application, so if the application was rejected, not refused. So if it was rejected, that usually means that there was some kind of, maybe a supporting document wasn't provided or some information wasn't correct. So it's not the Home Office saying we don't trust this organisation as a valid sponsor. It's just saying you haven't done your application right. But you would have to go back to the start and do it all again. You would get the application fee refunded.
Oh, right.
Which would come a period after, though. We've had this before where we've had clients apply and then come to us and say, we didn't get it, can you help? they've paid the application fee again, and they've got refunded the original one, you know, weeks, months after it. But it did, you know, it does come back.
Right. Okay.
So, but you would have to go through the whole application again.
All again. Right.
What the Home Office might do is they might contact you, which we've seen this before. There's no, with the Home Office, there's kind of there's not consistency in terms of they could do it one of two ways. They would either reject it and send you a letter saying it's been rejected, these are the reasons why, apply again, or they'll contact you and say, if they're feeling nice, they'll contact you and say, this is what you need to do to make sure this goes through. And we've had that before where, you know, I've had a client before who the application's been 90% right and it's been rejected, and they've had to apply again. And then I've had a client who's provided no supporting documents at all, which is quite a big failure. But then they've had an email from the Home Office saying provide them, and we'll look at it again. So not having, so there's no kind of, you know, but what I would say is, like, you know, it's important to obviously get it right the first time, because then if you have to apply again, you go back to the start, and you've probably waited.
Time consuming,
And you've probably waited 8 weeks. That's the problem. You probably waited 8 weeks, and then you get a letter saying it's been rejected, and then you have to do another 8 weeks.
Yeah, that's a bit too long, isn't it?
Yeah, which I think is the main issue with it, rather than having to, you know, having to spend time doing it all again, because 90% of your application's probably been okay.
Okay. No, thanks very much.
Anything else on that, Molly, or happy with that answer? Yeah.
No, yeah, that covered it really. It's just in case, obviously, especially with the smaller businesses, it's that whole application process. If they didn't get that refunded, they might not be able to afford another one. So it's just like making sure you get it right, really.
Yeah. If it was refused, though, if they said it's refused and you can't apply again, then they might take the application. You know, they would take the application. There's a slight difference in terms of the refund process.
Right. Okay.
So, you know, if it was rejected because there was a technicality, and they're inviting you to apply again, then they would refund. If it was rejected and you're subject to a cooling off period, they wouldn't necessarily refund it.
Right. Okay. No, thank you for that.
Lovely, thank you. And next it was Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you've actually put a further question in chat. So it'd be really good if you could pick both of your questions up, please.
Yeah, thanks. The first one was, does the employer or the sponsor, will he always carry all of the costs of the fees for the application? Or are there cases where the worker potentially would have to pay?
So yeah, so just in terms of the costs, I think Paige mentioned some of the visa costs as well. So it kind of all falls into the same sort of thing when you think, how much is it going to cost to sponsor someone? Well, there's the application fee for the sponsor license, then you've got the visa application fee, then the IHS, the immigration health surcharge, and then you've got the skills charge. So there's quite a few different costs that, and then you've got the charge to sign the certificate of sponsorship, the £199. So generally, what I would say is the sponsor license application fee, employer's cost, you can't really pass that on to the individual, because it might not just be the individual that you sponsor. The immigration skills charge, so you know, the £1,000 a year for the duration of the license, or that is an employer cost. You can't pass that cost on to the employee, because again, it's like a levy that's on sponsors. Everything else, and sorry, the certificate of sponsorship, the £199 employer cost. Everything else, like the visa application fee and the health surcharge, that's the employee responsibility, but an employer can pay for it if they want. So they could reimburse the individual.
Yeah, so they could, the employer potentially, if the employee isn't in the country, they want to pay everything up front first, they could do that, and then later on have the employee pay. Okay. And
you could have it that it's a bit like you know, like training costs, where you say if you stay with us for 6 months after you, or if you stay for, you know, you pay 50%, or if you stay with us for, you know, a year, none of the costs are repayable. It's a bit, you could try and structure it like that, but you would need the employment contract to reflect it.
Okay. Thanks for that. The other question was, working for an HR company who deal with various clients as a contractor, could an external HR company take on the role as authorised, maybe not authorised sponsor, but level 1? for the employer?
So yeah, so I'm just a UK-based representative. This is from the immigration rules. A UK-based representative can fill any key personnel role except the role of authorising officer.
Right, so they could be the level 1.
Yeah, but you would have to have a level 1 user that is an employee of the company as well. So you couldn't just have an external. You can have an external person as a level 1 user, but you have to have an employee as well.
Right, so there could, okay, I understand.
So it could be you and me on the sponsor license as level 1 users. You ask us to do everything, but you just have to be on there as a level 1 user. So because you have to have an employee as a level 1 user on the license, but you could have us on as well. And whoever does the work on it, could be both of us doing it. You could ask us to do it all. You could do it all yourself, and you could just have us on just in case. So, but it has to be, you have to have that person on there.
Okay, thank you.
That's all right.
Okay, anything you want to come back on that, Elizabeth, or is that clear from your
No, that's quite clear. Thanks very much. Yeah, thanks, Jo.
No problem. Next, we've got Rachel, and then if Mark can come in with his question. Thank you.
Hiya, was that me, Jo? Yeah, not Rachel Tyson.
Sorry, it's Rachel W that's put the question in chat.
Oh, about the apprentices, thank you. Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions actually. So first, thank you very much. That was really useful. So the first question is around, are apprenticeships included? You know, when we talked about the different jobs, the eligibility, are apprenticeships part of that?
Yeah, they are, because the apprentice, it's anyone you look to employ.
Right, okay. So regardless of, as long as the job comes within that job catalogue.
Yeah, and the right to work guidance, again, which is on the Home Office website, will say, anyone that you look to offer like an employment contract, which includes apprentices. So it would include those individuals.
Thank you. And then
I guess even if it didn't, I would probably do it anyway. Like if it was someone that didn't need it, like a self-employed contractor or something like that, or maybe someone that's doing work experience that might not be an employee,
right,
I'd still be doing a right to work check anyway. Just there might not be a legal requirement to do it, but it's probably better to do it, because if that individual didn't have the right to work, you've got like reputational issues, you've got things that you probably just want to avoid, where you could just do a check.
Yeah, okay. And then the second question was just a bit of a live example, really. So I've been in a forum this morning talking about construction apprenticeships and, how we can attract people to those apprenticeships. And overseas workers were discussed, as were refugees and asylum seekers. And one of the examples given by a construction worker was that he struggled with a language barrier before, and it's made things really, really hard. Is there anything, and it may be outside of this forum, so please do tell me if it is, but is there anything included in terms of support around how we assist with language barriers to make everything as smooth as possible?
Support in terms like what via the immigration process?
Yeah, I guess when we're completing the forms and things, obviously we'll need to communicate. Is there any support given for employees that maybe will have a language barrier?
There's, I guess what we're talking about, like if an individual has got a language barrier and they're trying to fill out a visa application form, for example, something like that. Well, I guess the company can provide support. For example, a visa an example would be, if a company approached us and said, look, we've got an individual we want to sponsor, we've got a sponsor license, skilled worker sponsor license, can you help with the visa process? We or you or anyone can fill in that application. Well, not anyone, but like an immigration advisor could fill in that application on behalf of the individual and submit the application on behalf of the individual. So we could do all of that and speak to the individual and clarify it, or the company could assist the individual and help them step by step with the visa process, for example. But that individual, unless they can use the app, would still need to attend a visa appointment and would still need to pass a an English language test if it was a skilled worker visa. So they've still got to go
Right,
through,
I see. So it's that's already done up front, right? Okay.
which includes like reading, writing, listening, speaking.
Yeah.
So they would have to meet a certain threshold. I think it's B1, I think level B1, but they would
Right,
have to
okay.
demonstrate that already. You can't really get around that.
No.
But there's always ways to help with the visa application process. I mean, yeah, we do. That's quite a common thing that we do, because people don't really want to do it themselves. And
yeah, okay, no, thank you. You've answered my question, because it sounds like it's done up front anyway. So yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Alan, I think you've answered my question just in that last discussion, but I'm going to ask it, so please excuse my ignorance here.
No problem.
Just once you receive your A rating for the as a firm, so you've got your sponsorship license A rating, is that just limited to one individual that you want to bring in, or once you do that application, is that give you the right as a firm to sponsor a group or a number of workers, migrant workers?
Yeah, so the A rating is the license. So the A rating is basically saying that you've meet all of the criteria that the Home Office has requested, and allows you to sponsor an unlimited amount of individuals. What the limit is how many certificates of sponsorship you have. So the license is the license, and the A rating is attached to the license. When you start looking to how can I bring this person over, how can I sponsor this individual, you have to apply for something, and this is, you apply for it via the sponsor license, but you have to apply for something called a certificate of sponsorship, and there's different types for different things. So if you had an individual in the UK, for example, that was applying for a skilled worker, it would be an undefined certificate of sponsorship. If it was an unrestricted certificate of sponsorship, if it was an individual outside, then it would be a different type. So you've got to get the certificate of sponsorship right. That's the first thing. And you can only bring people over and sponsor people once you've assigned that certificate. So if you had 5 people in mind that you wanted to bring over, you would need 5 certificates of sponsorship. You'd have to assign each of those certificates to each individual. That individual would then use that certificate of sponsorship, which is just a number, it's not an actual hard copy certificate, but they would use that number to start their visa application. So their visa application, the first question would be, what's your certificate of sponsorship number? And you can't really go any further with the application until you've got that. Then once you put it in, it brings up all the company's details and confirmation that you're sponsored by that employer. So that's how it works. And there's no restriction on how many certificates of sponsorship you can apply for. You just have to apply for them via the SMS. And there's certain information that you have to provide to the Home Office for them to approve that. But yeah, I mean, that's as long as, so if you were bringing over a skilled worker, for example, and you applied for a certificate of sponsorship, it's going to ask you things like, what's the SOC code? Is this a skilled job? What's the salary? Is it above the salary threshold? So it's going to ask you questions like that.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Right, we did have one question notified in advance, and that was from you, Shibi. Do you want to come in with your question, please? Are you there?
Yes.
Sorry, it's all of these different systems with different mutes, cameras, everything else. Welcome back into the room.
Yeah, I can tell you it's not been an easy process, but one of the issues, I think there were a few things that I was not aware of, and thank you for that. One thing is the IELTS, or the English test, especially for blue-collared workers and stuff. It's a nightmare. Is there something that you're aware that they speak English, they know how to read, write and stuff, but for them to pass a test, so we don't apply for their sponsorship till they actually complete the test, because as you said, it's 3 months. If we apply for the sponsorship, we can't just actually allocate the sponsorship license. That's been one of the nightmares I've had. Is there something that the government is planning to do, or is there, because it used to be easy to actually employ people from EU, but no longer, even they have to do the test.
Paige, did you want to just, does that fall within your the things that you covered? I can jump in as well if you want, because
Yeah, I think I mean, when you say that they're struggling, Shibi, is that they can't pass the test, or what's the issue that you're
They
coming
are
up
normally good in certain modules, but usually reading is where they actually, you know, they get to a level of 3, but they can't get to a level of 4.
Right.
Am I right in understanding that's the same level no matter where you're employing from? So that's where, you know, initially when I was going to apply for their sponsorship certificate, I didn't know about the IELTS or the English test. And thankfully, before I applied for the first one, I had to ensure they actually completed their exam, and quite a few people had failed.
Right. I mean, it depends. The English language level that you must meet does differ depending on some routes, but for the main route, so the skilled worker, it's B1, and I think that's categorized as competent in each module, like you say. So it's understanding, it's reading, it's writing, it's listening. If they're struggling with the test, then there's other ways that they can prove it. So like I said, if they have a qualification, and that can be if they studied at an English school and have A levels, for example. Alternatively, if they have a degree that was taught in English, or I think sometimes it can be modules or even a master's, then they can rely on that instead of the test. But obviously, if they've been taught a degree in English, then you know, they'd probably be matching that level. I'm not sure if they are going to make any changes. I know Liz Truss is looking to sort of make it more flexible and open things up a little bit more in terms of immigration. Whether or not that would include any changes to the English test, I think we'd have to wait and see. So I mean, I guess in terms of eligibility, they have to show that for the skilled worker route. Alan, I don't know if there's any sort of workarounds really, is there, if you can't meet that level for skilled worker anyway?
Just to let you know, if you're going for a personnel who are in the engineering or in the management level, I don't see that as an issue. But if you're going for, blue collared workers, where it is being put as a skill shortage, that's where I'm seeing issues with regard to the IELTS. They're ready to come, but it's just.
Yeah, the English language is being a problem. I mean, the only thing you could do is you can do sort of like mock testing around this. I know that doesn't, I don't know how to really answer the question other than they probably need to like practice and up their English language, because I mean the requirements are the requirements, and I don't think there's anything in place to say that the threshold's going to get lower anytime soon, for example. But what I would say is that you could do sort of mock tests in advance and try and get over the threshold and do it that way. But really, otherwise, there's nothing, otherwise, it's either improve your English language skills by doing mock tests and things like that, or you're going to have problems, I guess.
Yeah.
Are they skilled workers, Shibi, or would they be coming from an overseas entity within your business?
They're skilled workers, actually. It's in the skilled occupational skill shortage.
Because I guess the only other option to look at if it was available to you would be the global business mobility route, because the English language isn't a requirement for that. So if they fell within the senior or specialist worker, for example, then they wouldn't have to show it as part of that application.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
But they would have to be paid over.
That's been the biggest hurdle, so I don't actually, till they complete their test, I don't apply for their sponsorship license, because it'll be quite a big chunk of money. That's $199 plus 3 years immigration health that I'll be paying up.
And you would have to, then the problem is you couldn't provide, the supporting document, which is proof of English language, which is the certificate from the provider. So you've applied for the visa, and then you've wasted all of that money because you can't provide a key document. So yeah, that would make total sense. I guess the key thing is building in the time, really. because people forget that it's required, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, God, I've got to do the English language test, or meet the requirement, and then it can delay things.
Yeah, it has delayed quite a bit. And it's also another thing is also the TB test as well, if you're coming from certain countries. So that's also, if I know the person has not been living in that specific country, I ask them to carry out the TB test as well after they finish their English test, because that
That's exactly
can also
right.
delay.
100%, yeah, agreed. Which is why it's like, preparation, and if you haven't got a sponsor license, then you can do all these things while you're waiting your 8 weeks or your 10 working days for your sponsor license. So you can get things prepped up in advance.
Yeah.
Right, super. Has anybody got any other questions triggered by questions that colleagues asked in the room? No. So in terms of next steps, firstly, a huge thank you to Alan and Paige for the prep document that they provided in advance and for today's workshop session. I think the question from me is, on the basis of some of the challenges that you've identified, what we want to do is several things. Firstly, to demystify employing overseas workers, because I think it has taken on this huge, it's all horribly, horribly complicated. We're not saying there aren't complexities. I think people believe that it's far more difficult. I think the thing that surprised me was the number of routes that were potentially open, because people didn't believe that there was very much opportunity. And the third thing is to explore what else we can do to support our business community. So if we were looking at some kind of follow-up activity with Alan and Paige, what would be particularly useful? What would you, as representatives of some of our business community, appreciate that would help you to get through the process? And not to pick on anyone, but given that you've been through the process, Shivi, if you were looking at the LEP, what would you say it would be really helpful for the LEP to provide, to do, to make this process easier?
Initially, I went to the agents, and so I worked with the agents to get this. It's quite expensive for a smaller organization to do that. So I think if, as far as I know, after that I learned I could have done it myself. It was just, I can do it. So I think somewhere around training the employers actually how to go through each and every process, because my agent actually didn't tell me the whole process step by step. Thankfully, I read a lot, and I before I started doing certain things, I would have told them to apply for the sponsorship license if I didn't see how the point-based system worked. So it's just based on my previous experience that I know about it. It helped me a bit. So I think a bit more training on how to do the application process. But it's the fact, if you have selected your candidate, it's fine. But how do you go and select your candidates abroad? It's not easy, You have these agents in abroad. You need to have trustworthy agents whom you can go and speak. I have a couple of agents, so I've now built up a trust with them, though I haven't bought anyone through them. I'd done it in a separate way, but it's quite important to, to find the right agents as well, so people can trust them in employing the right candidate. So I think first is definitely training on how to do the application processes will be very helpful to them.
Sorry there. Thank you. Really, really appreciate your perspective. Anybody got any other thoughts before we come back to Alan and Paige for responses about what they feel able or unable to do in terms of further follow-up activity? Anybody else got anything that they would find particularly useful? Molly, you leant forward there as if you were ready to come in, prime for action. Is that just happening to lean forward?
It was just going to be a really quick one. It might even sound a bit obvious, but the presentation that you just presented to us, going through step-by-steps of how to do it, is there something like that we can present to our businesses as like how to, you know, sponsor an overseas worker really?
Yes, we've got various, I mean, I'm pretty sure we've got a document that just isn't related to immigration, but it through Womble Bond Dickinson, where we've got like a guide on how to employ overseas workers. And Paige, I think you had done something recently for this forum, you know, in terms of like an overview of the immigration system.
Yeah, so there's a note circulated earlier today, I think, and at the back of that, there's some flowcharts that have a guide, so how to firstly do the sponsor license application and then the separate visa application. And with that, there's some, you know, a bit more context to it and detail around the different routes that we talked about today, the costs, why you need a license and things like that. But if you look at that and there are sort of additional questions or you want to go through it again, then like we said at the start, these are the processes that we assist clients with all the time, and we'd be, you know, obviously happy to talk through anything with you.
No, that's brilliant. Lovely, thank you.
And there's a lot of information on the Home Office website. I would almost say there's too much information because it's information overload sometimes. And the problem is it's difficult for a lawyer to like the guidance that the Home Office does because it's very open to interpretation. You know, it's not like laws where it's really black and white. It's more guidance which can be interpreted in one of two ways. And I think that's the difficulty with the Home Office guidance document sometimes, because it can leave it open to interpretation. But if you get it wrong, you know, it's not open to interpretation because the Home Office will say you've not done this right, or, you know, and that's the problem, I guess. You know, and I think last thing I'd say is like that the classic is when you have defined and undefined certificates of sponsorship. So, you know, you think, well, why do we need two different types of certificates? But it's really important to get the right one, because if you assigned, let's say, an undefined certificate when you should have assigned a defined, you know, that could result in your license being revoked. And not many people, you know, it's quite complicated to understand the difference between the two and when to use one and when to use the other. So it is quite difficult. Yeah, there's lots of guidance out there, but you just got to be careful when you go through it.
So very conscious, and Mark's telling us he needs to leave in 2 minutes. Mark, we all need to leave in 2 minutes because it's the end of the workshop. So in terms of the information that's been provided, Molly, that was provided for our business community. So you can happily share that with your members. I think,
yeah, it's just like materials like that, whether we're allowed to sort of take them to our businesses, etc.
Yeah, you are happy, you know, and able to do that. I think it's then, you know, Shibi's suggestion was it would be good to do some very practical walkthrough workshops if Alan and Paige were happy to do that. But in order to do that, we need to know we've got an audience. So I think that would be something that would be spread much more widely and promoted as a specific support event. But is there anything else that people would find particularly useful from today's session?
I was just thinking, Jo, just mulling it over, and in terms of if we were to do this as a county, would we have one resource helping to do the administration around it? Because having walked through it, it sounds like that is something that's going to put people off, isn't it, potentially? Especially if you've not got resource allocated already. So I was just thinking if it is something we're serious about doing as a county, could we help in terms of coordinating it?
I mean, I think what we don't want to do is do agents out of business, because we're a business organisation. So that's not our job. I mean, I think it's how do we support our businesses to be able to take this forward. Shibi, you wanted to come back in?
Yes, I know people have been telling, you know, the workforce, skilled workforce, there's not too many skilled workforce as well. But I also want to address one point. One thing that Preeti Patel did, or when the Brexit happened, was she brought in post-study student workforce in the country, which is basically after 2 years, I mean, once they finish their education, they have up to 2 years they can work in UK. And if we think they are the right candidates for the job, we can continue to apply for their sponsorship license. And as far as I know a lot of students are now coming to me asking for jobs. So because we have employed post-study student workers, it's gone through like viral through the community, and people, there have been a lot of students asking me about this, but obviously I need to balance my workforce as well where I need them. And they're not fully skilled as well, but there are some skilled people who have come into the UK under this post-study side of it, where they have done their studies, but they are looking out for work as well, which the business community is not aware of.
Graduate visas, yeah. So I would say if I believe in London, this is what I've been told, there are a lot of students out there looking out for work, but they are not, they are engineering students, they are you know, a lot of other business students out there looking out for jobs. So if you're looking at, you know, a 2-year personal in your facility to work for or in your business to work, I would strongly consider, I would like you to consider them as well.
Okay, so we are going to close now. We will pick up with Alan and Paige on next steps. The thing that I'm hearing is some practical support and advice to businesses that want to make this step about how to do it, managing the process. Also got something from Caroline in the chat about attracting migrant workers to the UK. How do you actually go about sourcing them? How do you go about encouraging them? And something from Shibi about the opportunity for students to come into the workforce. Does that sort of summarize the key things that people feel will be of benefit to take forward with support from Alan and Paige? Yeah, we've got nods. So if we can pick that up outside of this meeting and agree some further actions, that would be fabulous. Can I say a huge thank you for joining us? Really, really appreciate your time. From the feedback I can see in the chat, people have found it really useful and informative. And if after this session something comes into your head that thinks, I wish I'd asked that, please do let us know, because we're continuing to work with Alan and Paige to take forward this kind of support for our business community. So lovely to see you all. Thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very much.
Thanks, Joe, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Take care, bye.